Welcome to the Autistic Delicatessen.
Let me tell you something. Let me tell you something. The food is great.
The food makes community. The food makes community.
What you eat and what you drink is your story.
Welcome to the Autistic Delicatessen. We are your hosts, Unikage and
Larnell.
So today's guest is going to be someone pretty interesting, someone from the academia fields. Are you looking forward to that, Larnell?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation and to get a more academic take, on the whole thing of food and religion mixed in together, though. Now, I'm just wondering, Oni, I've been to some lectures outside of food, and sometimes they've been very interesting conversations at colleges, even though I've been more to a broadcasting school than a college, because back in the day I didn't really pass the entrance exam. So I just thought, I'm not doing that stuff. And I wasn't really much of a university type of guy. So when you were at uni, did you ever have interesting lectures that you saw or from professors that had interesting things to say?
Yeah, I have actually. I've been to quite a few lectures, seminars on basic academia, lecturers and other people in the academia field, and ranging from things like multimedia, creative industries, queer theory, things like that. Not so much on the food front, but in that way, I'm used to academic writing, so I can appreciate a topic being discussed in that way. So with food and food politics, I'm actually looking forward to this conversation.
Oh yeah, definitely. And definitely some stuff to really get out of. So, definitely check this out.
Today's guest is Will Schanbacher, an assistant professor of religious studies at the University of South Florida in Tampa. His research investigates issues in religion, anti-racism, and social justice in food systems. He has also written a few books relating to those topics, such as Food as a Human Right, Combating Global Hunger and Forging a Path to Food Sovereignty, as well as The Politics of Food, the Global Conflict Between Food Security and Food Sovereignty. Well, welcome to the Autistic Delicatessen. It's great having you here.
Thank you.
When it comes to food, why is food considered a religious activity?
Great. Thanks, Oni. And hey, Larnell, real quick, thanks for having me on. This is great. Too bad we couldn't be sharing a meal together, because that's kind of in the answer, right? I mean, I think the thing that I like about food so much is the fact that we can share it together. But so you ask, why is food a religious activity? This is an interesting question, and I've thought about this. I teach in the area of religion and food, so I think about this quite a bit. And for many people, I think when we hear food and religion, our minds tend to go to, I seem to remember learning about, different religions have dietary laws that we must follow. We've heard of kosher laws in Judaism or halal laws in Islam. And these are very important. But for me, when I think about food, I also think beyond some of those things. And food really, over the years that I've been studying it, has become sort of a more holistic way of understanding the topic of religion. So religions themselves have been at times controversial because of the fact that they have been wars have been fought under the banner of religion. Certain conflicts have used religion as sort of the motivating factor, or the way to sort of galvanize, following from the masses. But in reality, we also see some positive aspects of religion, depending on which way we approach the issue, and specifically how broad our definition of religion is. So when I think about religion and the definition of religion, this is really where it comes into the food comes into the picture. So when we think about religion, we think about things like rituals that are involved in religion, or we think about symbols that are involved, such as the cross or the crescent in this the moon, or various peace signs. We also think about things like sacred myths and stories that are involved in all global religions. We think about the fact that religions involve gathering together in community. We also think about the systems of ethics and morals that are diverse and are involved in all religious traditions too. And then lastly, we might think about, at least here in, the American or Western European context, we think about something like a transcendent or a sacred power, something that lies beyond us as humans. And so that's kind of how we sort of traditionally define religion itself. But the question becomes for me, how does this relate to food? And how does food itself, as you all sort of mentioned at the very beginning, how is religion itself possibly thought about in terms of food and food practices? And when I break things down into those categories, for example, that I just mentioned, this is where we start to really see, at least for me, some interesting connections. So if we talk about rituals, for example, when it comes to food, we think about, we've got one ritual here in the United States coming up, Thanksgiving. And a Thanksgiving meal has all of these rituals associated with it, right? We prepare the turkey, we gather around family, often travel to visit one another. There are certain ingredients, there's certain traditions that are involved in the Thanksgiving meal that are important. But this is beyond even just holidays. We think about, rituals, the ritual gathering of around the dinner table, for example. This is where we share, we laugh together, we share stories, so on and so forth. So in that sense, we see, there are food rituals just as important as we have religious rituals, things like communion or things like going to church service or to mosque or to synagogue every single week. We do the same sort of things. There's preparation, there's getting dressed, there's, getting the family, the kids ready, there's complaining that's going on, there's laughter that's going on. All the things that you find associated with the religious rituals, we find in some, weekly rituals, around things like the dinner table or holidays. We also see symbols that are involved in those rituals, but also important for food and religion too. So what are some of the symbols that we think about, right? Well, bread, for example, is one symbol, right? We see bread as something that is involved in all religious traditions. We see it in sacred stories like the manna or the bread that falls from heaven in our monotheistic religions. We see bread as that which is served at communion meals in churches across the country, right? Whether it's in the form of a tiny wafer or an actual piece of bread itself. So just ingredients themselves can be important. But we also see symbols such as a lack of food, so an absence of food itself, which also is representative in religious traditions about the need for food or bread or whatever it may be. We can, and this really sort of relates back to our or to my comment about the role or the intersection between religion and things like the sacred stories or the sacred myths that we find in all of our religious traditions, right? So, what one story, just for example, to take, one of our Eastern traditions like Buddhism, this is a great example. When we think about Buddhism, we don't necessarily think of a culture that is rich with food, but in fact it is. And food plays many stories, not only in the countries that we find Buddhism, right? In Thailand, Vietnam, these great, diverse types of food, everything from the spiciest foods that we can find on earth to just more traditional Southeast Asian foods. But in Buddhism itself, we've got this great story. The story of the Buddha is one of my favorite ones. Siddhartha, he's going around, he's searching for these great questions, right? For those of you unfamiliar with the story of the Buddha, just briefly, the Buddha is sort of raised in this palace of luxury, and he's kind of hided from the outside world. He doesn't know what's going on in the world, and he eventually, as he grows older, he ventures outside, against his father's wishes, right? Because his father's trying to protect him from all the the dangers of the outside world. But he eventually becomes curious, as we all do as human beings, right? And he travels outside of the palace walls, and he starts to see these different sights, and he starts to see the world. And what he finds after these travels is one characteristic that is common to all human beings: is we suffer to a certain extent, and for various reasons. And he develops these questions about suffering. And so, long story short, he travels and he talks to religious mystics and to various folks, trying to find the answers to these deep questions. Why do we suffer? Why are people sick? Why are people hungry? Things of that nature. And he meditates and he thinks about it. At one point during his journey, he pauses and he decides that he's going to sort of abstain from eating food, to the point where he becomes so emaciated you can almost see through his rib cage, right? He's so skinny. And as the story goes, he realizes, well, this can't be the meaning of life, right? I can't find these answers. Why? Because I can't even think straight because I'm so hungry. And as the story goes, when he eventually makes this decision that maybe depriving oneself of food is not the case, as one Buddhist sort of narrative says, is that he's approached by this milkmaid, and she offers him some rice porridge, right? So the Buddha begins his real journey towards enlightenment after he gets enough food to eat. Once he sort of makes that turn in towards a meditation. So that's just one story. We have all kinds of other stories in Christianity and Islam. Islam, for example, food is a very important part of Ramadan, right? This is a case in terms of rituals and sacred narratives where we abstain, we fast from food as a way to glorify God. And at the end of Ramadan, within Islamic cultures, often many sheep will be killed for the purposes of charity. The actual meat that is used will be distributed across the world to help feed orphans and the poor and those in need. So we've got all kinds of these sacred stories that are derived from religious texts across global religions. And then lastly, kind of as I mentioned before, we have, food being a way in which we can start to get a glimpse into the moral systems of different religions, right? What does it mean when it comes to things like dietary laws, what foods we should and should not eat? Why shouldn't we eat certain types of foods? And for my interest in particular, we start to see, and this is one thing that is common across all global religions that I've seen, whether they are monotheistic, i.e., they believe or think about one God, or if they are more nature-based, or some might even call, polytheistic, many different gods or goddesses. They all have some sort of underlying ethic or moral that involves feeding. And this is where food becomes really important, right? All of a sudden, when we talk about the cultural things of food, we talk about the stories of food, sometimes we lose sight of that very religious moral ethic that is that is across all religious traditions, i.e., feeding those in need, feeding those in poor. And that takes not just different types of foods and things like that, that just calls all human beings to an ethic of care, an ethic of compassion, an ethic of looking out for those who don't have enough food. And so on that level, it's a little less interesting in the sense that we, want to talk about our favorite foods. We need to make sure people have enough food before we can even have this discussion. Let's face it, Oni and Larnell, everyone, the only reason we're here right now in front of our computer screens is because we were able to eat, right? And there's many people, the United Nations estimates, say 25,000 children today will die or suffer from malnutrition and hunger alone. So there's just a basic fact that we just don't have enough food. And so that really, when we start to think about the ethics, the rituals, the religious narratives that are involved with food, then we start to see this sort of parallels, the definition of food and religion, and those similarities, at least for me, are quite striking. And this is really where I kind of see that connection between religion and food.
It's like it's very interesting, like what you already put out right there, even with the religion and food stuff, because me and Oni here on this show, like we've had like some Sikhs on our show, which in terms of Sikhism, or Sikhism or however ever you
Yeah.
say it, like their thing about like being able to give food is from a more vegetarian type of standpoint and all that stuff, because they give more of like vegetarian meals through mangars, like at their like gurdwaras and all that stuff, kind of like how churches have food pantries or just like places to where like they're able to give food out to the homeless and all that stuff, because I've in the past like have worked with food pantries at churches and all that stuff, so I know that type of stuff right there, to be able to give it to the community. And it's all about based on the principles of the religious leader or Jesus, or being the hands and feet of Jesus or anything like that. And I want to get to like the fact of like humanitarianism within food and all that stuff, and you touched a little bit on like food disparities and all that stuff, and we just had a past guest talk about like like food deserts and all that stuff, like even in like more like inner city and urban communities. So can you explain a little bit on that in terms of the humanitarianness as well as some of the food deserts and disparities, if you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, thanks, Larnell. That's great. And it's funny. It's funny that you mentioned the Sikhs and the Gurdwaras and Langars, because that reminds me many years ago, 15 years ago or so, when I was in graduate school, one of my best experience, I was living in Los Angeles at the time, was when I had the opportunity to go to a Sikh temple and join in their community meal. And it was the most, as a younger kid, it was the most eye-opening experience. LA itself is a diverse city, but going and sitting down and being welcomed, I was a teaching assistant at the time, and I brought my class there, and they welcomed, and the Sikh group like brought us in, and we all sat on the floor right of the Gurdwara in this little common area, and we shared a meal with one another. And that's how we got to learn more about the religious tradition, was over food. And there was really something beautiful about that. And that is really sort of something that is just at the core of Sikhism as a religion, but also at the core of many religions, that sharing of meals. But that was really beautiful. But it segues really nicely into your point about humanitarianism, right? The idea that, sharing a meal, as my experience in the Gurdwara was, can also extend beyond sharing the meal in the community. And we've seen this historically in the sense of sharing the meals, sharing food with the world. And that comes on a broader scale in terms of things like humanitarian aid, whether that's on a global level, a massive level, and providing food to impoverished countries or developing countries, or whether it's more localized, as you mentioned, Larnell, and things like soup kitchens or food pantries, things like that. And that's really where we get between religion and food, and ethical values or moral values. And I think this is where we start to get into a conversation that is a little more controversial and a little trickier, especially for folks who are believers, right? And sometimes these sort of the ethical or moral precepts and imperatives that we find in different religious scriptures and traditions really kind of hold us to task when it comes to things like food charity, and really question all beliefs. And this is kind of across the board of whatever religion you're kind of looking at. Take us to task about, okay, what are we doing to actually live up to the standards that our different religious faith traditions or scriptures are telling us. And so when it comes to things like food, charities, I think here I'll start just in the United States. We have, sometimes for many young people here in the US specifically, their first experience with like sort of humanitarian work is going to be as they're growing up and they go to a soup kitchen, or they, devote their time for a food drive, collecting food at their, religious organization to go give to another, larger charity for further distribution, things like that. And so these are great opportunities for charity, but I think for us, we need to start to ask, and for me as a scholar, we need to ask, what is the motivation behind this, right? And we have various different, examples. In some cases, religious organizations, churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever, will engage in charity activity for the purpose of what? The purpose of converting people to their religion, right? Some, and this is kind of the more sort of pessimistic side, it's there, so we have to be very honest. I mean, this is why sometimes it's sort of like, here's a meal and let me introduce you to my faith tradition, right? Sometimes it's a little more kind of moderated or benign, where it's simply, I, as a believer of X religion, am called to provide food for the poor or for the needy, and I'm just going to do that because this is what my religion tells me to do. So this is really where I think it becomes an interesting conversation. Why do people engage in these things, right? And the same holds true on an international level. Why does the United States, for example, provide food aid to other countries? Is it simply because the United States, would like to argue that it is a benevolent country that is giving to others, right? Or do we see the downside, as history has shown us, where the United States has provided food in turn for what, right? It's a trade for things like military bases, for allyship, political allyship, things of that nature. So that's where you start to really kind of see the more shady side of international food charities. But what is important about this when we talk about religion and sort of the ethics that are underlying certain religious beliefs that I've avoided in these examples that I've just kind of mentioned here the last couple of minutes is what? The fact that we need food aid in the first place. And that is betrayed by the fact that we have so many people that live in poverty and hunger around the world. And yet, as food scholars will tell you, scientists, but also, scholars in various other food-related academic disciplines will tell you the research is clear. We have plenty of food on this planet. We produce enough food to feed the world. And you'll hear these narratives, oh, well, the population is spiraling upwards. We're never going to be able to feed this many people in the next 20, 25, 50 years. That evidence is unclear. And at best, it just shows that we need to have this on our radar. But right as we speak today, we have plenty of food to feed the world. And the problem is more in terms of how we distribute food, how food is produced, by what model. Is it produced by our current industrialized food system that is highly reliable on chemicals, pesticides, unfair labor conditions, right? That we start to really get to the core of why we have such a bad food problem in the first place. We have lost touch with where our food is produced, how it's produced, who produces it, and whether or not it's healthy because of the industrialized food system that runs by these narratives, talking about narratives, again, that theme that runs by the narrative that we have to have this industrialized, fast-paced, homogenized, food system that is going to really, involve saving humanity. And that's just not the case. We have plenty of evidence to show that local food production can be healthier, can actually produce more food. It's just a matter of political will to engage in and think about models that does that. And so to address your second point, Larnell, this really leads us to a more local issue here in our communities in the United States, in every city that you find, whether it's where I live in Tampa, Florida, or other cities that I've lived in, Los Angeles, North Carolina, places, Denver, Colorado. You have these things called either food deserts. Also here, another popular term down in the South, right? Food swamps, right? Food deserts are characterized by areas where you physically, geographically do not have certain communities do not have access to grocery stores with healthy food choices, with healthy options, with affordable options, right? And these lines change, depending on who you're talking to, but anything that within a mile radius of where you live, if you can't find a healthy grocery store, this might be considered what we call a food desert, right? You just don't have access to it. Food swamps, on the other hand, are similar, but food swamps are sort of areas where you have an overabundance of unhealthy food options, right? So you can get food, but it's going to be at your at gas stations, right? It's going to be at fast food outlets, things of that nature. You're going to find more liquor stores, in areas too. So you have this combination of fast food, unhealthy food, gas station food, liquor stores. Instead of healthy foods, instead of farmers markets, instead of even grocery stores that provide at least that access. And so this is where you start to see again a real ethical problem when it comes to our current food system. And this is really what it comes down to. This is sort of the underlying narrative here, is where do we find food deserts in our food swamps? It is in underserved, underprivileged communities of color. This is where our communities of color have been hit hardest by our food system, and where I would say arguably we have an unjust food system. If we're going to talk about ethics and morals, we have an unjust food system. COVID-19, for example, has really exposed the injustice or injustice of our food system. We see across the board so far early evidence, and COVID. It's really unfortunate that COVID has exposed this, because this was going on before COVID. But if we look at early data coming out from COVID, we see that Black, Latinx communities of color are disproportionately food insecure since the beginning of this year, when COVID really hit hard, and in March when the economy started shutting down. Those numbers have spiked, and we can see this because we have evidence from what happened in 2008 and 2009 during that economic downturn. The same exact thing is happening. We're starting to see the early signs of it, and I'll bet my house that we see it, in in the next year. When the economy goes down, what communities are hurt the most? What communities specifically are most food insecure? It's our communities of color. And this is a historical cycle that really, if we're going to be honest from a religious perspective, and this is not saying any one religion in particular is guilty, but if we are, and I am as a scholar of religion, aware that all religious traditions at some level say feed the poor, feed the hungry, then there is some sort of major disconnect here because we have such a problem, as it stands today. So this is really where I kind of approach the issue of food and humanitarian work.
It's really sad that food has to get extremely political and how they are treated, especially mainly in the West, is the whole overabundance of food, and it's more likely you can find unhealthy stuff and healthy stuff. And even if the healthy stuff is cheap, some places there's barely any healthy options at all. It's you're more likely to get, as you said, liquor, alcohol, chocolate, crisps, all that, rather than an apple, lettuce. And it's sad because I've learned that cooking things, healthy things, isn't as difficult. But if you're living in a place, for example, a rural area, it'll be a lot more difficult unless you grow by yourself. And that is just one of the saddest of things when it comes to like the industry and how it's industrialized. Because food is made for others, it's supposed to serve others. And that's also the same parallel as like the whole religion thing, ritual, serving others, making things for others. We all have food in our bellies, we're healthy, we chat along and all that. It's just sad that it gets to something big and nasty with the bigwigs, how it's just there's so much food getting wasted out there, and I just get so disappointed with the industry when it comes to that, and it's more complicated than it should be.
Yes, Oni, I think you make an excellent point, and again, COVID really sort of exposed this. We saw countless stories of fresh produce, right, that had to be dumped on the side of highways that farmers had to just plow over. Why? Because they simply did not have the access to the distribution system that they needed. When things started to shut down, there was no longer the demand, or even if where there was demand, there was no way of transporting that food. And the reason I would argue that that is the case is because of our industrialized food system. The industrialized food system, and this is where we really have to kind of be honest with each other, right? I mean, here in Florida, it's shocking. If you go to your local grocery store, right, one of the big chain box grocery stores, and go and buy some avocados, right, you will see quite often, more often than not, the avocados that we're buying here in Florida are from Mexico or California.
Why?
California produces most of our food here in the United States. And I could point you to the specific location in Southern California, right, where that food is produced, and it's just transported all over. But I mean, and I understand that needs to happen in some, I'm originally from Colorado. We have a growing season, that's relatively short. You can still grow a ton of food, but it's shorter than what it is here in Florida, what it is in Southern California, and various other climates that are more conducive to agriculture. But the fact of the matter that we're buying food from thousands of miles away, right? I think the estimate is roughly 1,500, I think it is, miles between the farm to our dinner plates, and the fact that it has to travel so far begs the question of, is something wrong with the current food system and distribution system in the first place? And Oni, this is exactly to your point. We do have the ability to produce own foods. Rural areas used to have the ability to produce all of their own food, but now instead of producing it for our families, for our local communities, the industrialized food system has created such a situation where we no longer do that. It's no longer economically feasible for small farmers to produce their own food. Why? Because they are under these demands of the big food corporations that say we need to produce as much food as possible, as efficiently as possible, and as soon as possible. And all of a sudden, when you get into that mindset where your middle people, your middlemen, in the thing that are demanding these large quantities of food, which in turn demands big trucks to haul that food, so on and so forth. All of a sudden, when you get something like COVID that hits and those supply side and supply chain sort of mechanisms shut down, everything goes to crap, right? and everything goes to waste, both literally and figuratively speaking. We have wasted so much food that could have been connected to our local communities. And there are, and this is where my research in the concept of food sovereignty, local production for local consumption, becomes so important, right? Because when we start to re-envision and rethink about ways in which we can produce our own foods locally for local consumption first, this is where we start to circumvent all these problems that COVID has showed us, but even problems that were growing and existing before COVID, right? And this is where I really, sort of challenge our political leaders, if we want to be honest with it, is to adopt models that are based on food sovereignty and growing food locally. And that is going to, really be, I see the way kind of forward in the future.
It's very interesting because it seems like it sounds to me like a more humanitarian spirit, just like the same with religions and all that type of stuff, because I feel like at times like it's good to have the food pantries from the churches. It's good to have like mosques and gurdwaras and synagogues too as well, and all it's to be able to give like free challah bread, like during the time of like Passover and all these other Jewish holidays to people, even to the less fortunate and all that stuff. But at the same time, it's like what about governments and all that stuff? Not just like local governments, even in Florida and all that stuff, to be able to help. I think there should be a balanced thing to where we're not reliant on just the religious communities to give all this stuff, because the reason why people can't get food is because there's not enough resources. And what else can they do and all that stuff? I think we need the religious community, but at the same time, we also need governments to start understanding. And I'm sure for you, Oni, too, as well, it's the same within the UK, because you have like those nonprofit organizations as well as,
Yeah.
the churches and all that stuff. But at the same time, governments that are not really doing enough to be
No.
able to also provide and give their share too as well.
The thing is, there's things like food banks and that, and even if not all of them are religious based or charity based, there is some sort of government kind of thing. But I think it depends on the council region of that country. For example, in Scotland, some of them can vary and differ, but there is definitely not enough scenario and a lot of wastage. And also when it comes to like agriculture, a lot of rural places get the shaft as due to the higher industrial things like, oh, we have all the big machines, we don't need these small farmers anymore. And it's kind of a bit, we kind of need the small ones to appreciate how food is made in that, because if you just get it from a machine, it's kind of lifeless and they make more than what they need, and that's like wastage, and it's not really cool, is it?
You both make a really interesting point, and I think this is something essential. When we talk about, when we start to talk about things where, okay, and Larnell, I agree with you 100%. For emergency situations, you need, small like religious organizations, for example, are essential. They're connected directly to the people in the neighborhoods, in the communities, and sometimes they're the best ways, the best means through which to distribute food, to gather food, things like that. But at the end of the day, they are not, their mission is not to be massive food charity organizations. They're just on a capacity level, they're not equipped to do that as much as they would like to. And this is why, the research will show us that many times small churches, small mosques, or religious organizations will gather food and give it to larger, more organized organizations, Feeding America or whatever it is, to actually distribute that food, because that's what they are, that's what their organization is meant to do. Religious organizations aren't. Nonetheless, as you say, these are essential organizations. But then when you mention the role of government also playing a role, and I think you're right. But here is where I think we can find, all of a sudden you're going to get, a lot of red flags. People say, I don't know, no more government involved in things. And this is where I would like to suggest we could find a meeting ground between our political parties. So you're correct in saying that the government needs to play a role, but it might not necessarily be in that sense that everyone wants to say, oh no, more government, more government. No, perhaps it's, as Oni mentioned, government can support local food producers, right? I think local farmers across the political divide that get so angry about the system and get so angry at each other because they think they're fighting with one another, food becomes a way, and food production becomes a way where both sides can unite, and I know this from living both in Colorado for half of my life and here in the South for half of my life. It shocks me how supporters of both political parties, when it comes to the level of food production and supporting local farmers and local food producers, actually are fighting the same cause. And if they can just understand that despite their strong political differences in other areas, this is one way where food unites us once again. because they would all agree that right now the government support of the food and agricultural industry is going only to who? To big food corporations, those big wigs, those deep pockets, those big farmers that are that are benefiting, that are profiting off of the unhealthy conditions in communities of color, but also in our regular middle class families who are forced to eat this food that is produced by the industrial food system. So this is where we can find that happy medium between government intervention and support, but it's supporting the small scale, the local farmers, the working people, not these big corporations as the system has it set up right now.
Definitely. When it comes to like racial injustice in the food system, um, what examples could you explain? Like example of certain foods made from other countries, but they could be left out due to other countries not supporting them because they can't provide the materials and farming and stuff.
Yeah, right. Well, so when it comes to the racial injustices in the food system, this is another huge topic. And again, this is something where I'd be remiss to not mention COVID kind of exposing this again, right? And this is where you do have sort of these dual pandemics going on, racism and COVID itself. But in terms of that sort of dual pandemic expressed in the food system, as I mentioned before, you see communities of color, in terms of a public health perspective, are significantly higher at risk for food related diseases like higher heart disease, like type 2 diabetes, things of that nature. And this is simply because of the diets that certain communities of color are forced to eat because there is no access to certain foods. And this is where we really start to see the harsh details of the food system itself. And it's not because certain cultures like to necessarily eat worse foods. Of course, that's across the board. We all we all have, regardless of our ethnic background, have types of foods that we shouldn't eat because they're unhealthy, if that's what our concern is. But bottom line is, when us more affluent white people like myself can afford to buy certain types of food, healthier foods, have access to healthier foods, have access to healthcare when I start eating bad foods and that has negative dietary and health effects on my body. All of these things combined start to multiply and really exacerbate the structural racism that we find not only in our institutions across the board, as we see with COVID, but the structural injustices when it comes to food related institutions. Why is it, as we mentioned before, why is it that we have fast food restaurants in abundance in our lower socioeconomic communities? Why is it that we have gas station food being the only option in many of our areas of low socioeconomic demographics? Why is it that we have an abundance of liquor stores, for example, in these same communities, right? This all comes back to, and we can trace this back all the way to the end of slavery, right? Of perpetual and cyclical forms of racism that are expressed on an institutional level. And that institutional level includes the institution of the food system, whether it's on the level of the grocery stores, the big food producers, the big food distributors, or even the folks who control things like the seed industry that is meant to grow the foods, right? This is where we need to mention corporations like Monsanto and Cargill in terms of their patenting of seeds and food producing seeds that has completely undermined both national farmers here, but also farmers on a global scale. And so real briefly, Oni, this is where we can mention sort of the international dimensions of this. And this really has its roots. We don't have time today to talk about it, but historical roots in post-World War II economic policy here in the US, where we started to see this massive upsurge of agricultural production, right? One of the Earl Butts, one of these famous political figures, was coined saying the term, we need to grow from fence post to fence post, with the idea that America is the world's breadbasket and we can produce enough money for, to feed, or money, food to feed the world. And it is under these types of philosophies that all the way up until, the present day, we have created a situation in which we produce more food than what we need here in the United States. And that in turn can be used, those surpluses of food can be used to give to other countries. The problem with that case is often when we flood food, or as we kind of call it in sort of my area of work, when we dump that food, that surplus food that we produce here in the United States into other economies in primarily developing countries, least developed countries. What happens is, yes, it might provide cheaper food for some sectors in those countries, i.e. urban areas. What it does is it ultimately undermines those rural communities in foreign countries and destroys their livelihoods. Now, all of a sudden we have a situation that like we saw in COVID, except every single day this happened prior to COVID in other countries, where farmers are forced to do things like what? Empty their milk storage containers, dump their food, their fresh fruits and vegetables. Why? Because they can no longer sell it in their own countries, because food from the United States, from Europe, from wealthier Asian countries is being dumped or flooded into their economy by way of things like charity, right? By way of food aid. But that in turn destroys those local communities in foreign countries. And this is where we really start to see a problem when it comes to, things like food aid on a global scale.
And wow, Will, like you're giving us some information today, and we can talk more on this and all that stuff, but I just have to say that on our shows we ask these guys different things though. But do you have like a favorite type of food that you enjoy?
Thanks, Lauren. Yeah, I know. Sometimes this stuff gets pretty heavy really quickly, and we do face. I mean, at the end of the day, I think what we're trying when we come back to religion and food, right? I think there's also one thing that we failed to mention is there is a sense across the board, whether it's religions that have a concept of God or Buddhism that does not necessarily. All of it is to a certain extent about liberation and enjoying life and ending suffering, right? So at the end of the day, we got to kind of try to return back to this commonality between all of us, is the fact that we love food and we love sharing it with each other, and we want everyone to have enough of it at the same point in time. So to that extent, you got to ask that question, man. And this is a tough one. I don't know. I would have to say, at the end of the day, it would have to be like a good street taco. Maybe a carne asada taco or a carne asada burrito. I think I would have to. When I lived in California, Southern California was kind of famous for their tacos. But if you on Mexico,
Okay.
Mexico has this rich history of tacos too, and the different types of meat. So I think if I one food to go to, this can maybe conclude us, right? That last part of religion that we often talk about, that transcendent or that sort of experience of the sacred. Some theorists call it. For me, there's nothing better than a good street taco amongst friends.
And before I close up, where can we find you online in terms of social media,
Yeah.
research, books, whatever?
Sure. Well, let's see here. Now you're putting me on the spot. My first book was called The Politics of Food, the Global Conflict Between Food Security and Food Sovereignty. My latest book is Food as a Human Right. But you can contact me anytime at Will Schanbacher at gmail.com or William48 at USF.edu. So yeah, I think the best way to contact me is if you just look at USF.edu, the Department of Religious Studies there. You can email me and I'd be happy to talk about this stuff.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Will. Thank you for joining the Autistic Delicatessen. It was great having you here.
Thank you all for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah,
No
thanks a
worries.
lot, man.
Well, guys, thank you for watching the Autistic Delicatessen. If you enjoyed this content, feel free to look at the podcast and other links in the autisticdelicatessen.card.co. That's where all the links will be.
And please subscribe to our YouTube channel for future content. Until next time.
What you eat, what you drink is your story.